Welcome to Keeping the Beacon Lit. This is a weekly live podcast recorded right here on X.com, the Spaces platform. This is a podcast designed for and by authors to help each other stay inspired and persist through the darker times. Um, the purpose of this podcast is for myself, A.B. Timothy, the host of the podcast, to inspire my fellow writers and my fellow world builders in this case to continue on their adventures and on their journeys in spite of whatever difficulties they may be facing in the real world. The sort of philosophy behind this show is that writing is not a selfish endeavor, in my opinion, and it never should be. Writing is a selfless endeavor and should be viewed that way because you are not writing for you alone. You are also writing for all those coming after you who will read your writing, and they deserve the best from you, and you deserve to give them the best you're capable of. So this show, Keeping the Beacon Lit, is all about that, just staying inspired, helping inspire others, and showing them the path that we took to get where we are, so that they may climb it easy. In today's episode in particular, we'll be discussing world building. World building is a vital piece of any writing you do. The idea of world building is typically relegated to a much larger scale than it needs to be. Typically, when people talk about world building, they mean literally designing new worlds for fantasy creatures and fantasy stories and science fiction stories and creatures. But the reality is, world building is something as small as how you design a scene or how you set a scene. So, for example, I know someone who's writing stories in my hometown of Tucson, Arizona. So they're contemporary fiction stories that take place in modern day Tucson, Arizona. How much world building will you need? Well, if you're writing to somebody who lives in Beijing, China, or Antarctica, and has never stepped foot in Arizona, you're going to need an awful lot of world building because they don't know what they're looking at. They don't know the style of culture. They don't know the people. They don't know the environment. You can describe it all again afresh. Or you could do like us fantasy writers are known to do and blow it way up and say, okay, I'm creating entire new planets, ecosystems. I know of someone who literally is designing a new laws of physics for their world because they want to have complete control over the setting that they're writing. So, there's many different levels of world building, but today we'll just kind of be generally talking about whatever level authors here among us will be discussing their own works at. So it could be some authors may be discussing worlds they're creating, some authors may be discussing scenes they're setting, describing. Myself, I'll probably be describing the settings because the world I'm working in is medieval Britain, which is a well-known setting, but there's still much to be done in the world building process there. Joining me today, I have three fellow authors. I have S.S. Fitzgerald, J.M. Goodwin, Sisteroth. Sisteroth is someone I know in real life who has spent much time building worlds and creating factions and races and societies and writing war timelines and a lot of things that I can remember from our conversations years ago, and very excited to have him on the show. J.M. Goodwin is author of a book that I named in the announcement. The Isle Called Strife, fantasy writer, and of course S.S. Fitzgerald, also here. My computer is not playing friends tonight. Second. Oh, of course. Yeah. He is a horror author. He is one among a great cohort on this show. I somehow managed to get a lot of horror authors to appear on my show, which is awesome, despite how little horror I actually read. It's good to have a range of perspectives. Yeah, I'm going to give all of them now a chance to introduce themselves to see if there's anything I may have missed or anything they'd like to plug here at the beginning, real quick. We can do. So let's start actually with, and I just talked about SS Fitzgerald. Go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about what you do.
Hey, thanks, Timothy. So yes, I'm SS Fitzgerald. You can just call me Sean, and that's probably how everybody's going to refer to me during this interview. I'm the author of the Alone Together series, which is a horror and post-apocalyptic series that starts in Florida. Um, Before that, I wrote Sinner's Pass, which is, if you've ever seen like Silent Hill, either the game or the movie, or read one of their novels, very much in that vein of world twisting. And then prior to that was a science fiction novel called A Fold to Extinction.
Very cool. Sounds like you have a great breadth of knowledge, and sure you'll have a lot of exciting stuff to talk about. Um, how about you, Goodwin? Introduce yourself. Introduce what you're working on these days, and maybe talk a little bit about what you're bringing to the table.
Sure. So, J.M. Goodwin, as you said, author of The Isles Called Strife, which is I would say, a Roman-inspired, Roman Republic era epic fantasy story. Uh, and I'm working on the sequel as we speak. Definitely enjoying that. Planning to have about 5 books in the series. So, very excited to be here today.
Awesome. Series are always fun. And Zisteroth, who is also known as Nathaniel. Go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit. Talk about the world you're working on building, and anything you're currently writing. So this is particularly an authorial program. So you mentioned in our DMs that you're working on writing a book for this setting that you have created. So feel free to talk a little bit about that and what your plans are there.
All right, yeah, I'm Nathaniel Zisroth, as my username is. I am been working on a fantasy setting for about 8 years, 8.5 ish, and I finally started to sit down and actually write a story in it. And so uh, it's it's a it is an epic fantasy setting with a lot of uh, detail on nations. Like I specifically focus on politics and such.
Very cool. Yeah. So I've you and I have talked a little bit about that in person, and I'm excited to get that on the show and sort of dig into it a little bit. So the purpose of this episode, as I said, is to talk about world building, and sounds like we have a good range of scopes here. Myself, my name is AB Timothy. I'm a fantasy writer. I've been writing for close to 12 years, if not over 12 years at this point, and I'm currently working on a Arthurian fiction novel. So it's based in medieval Britain, and that's my current goal is to publish that in May of this year. And we'll have a lot to discuss when it comes to the world building of it because some people aren't very familiar with the Arthurian legend. I'd assume most fantasy authors are very familiar with the Arthurian legend, but many of our readers perhaps aren't. So it'll be much to discuss. Very excited. So the first question I always ask is almost the same question every time. What is the main inspiration behind your current work in progress? So the thing you're working on now that isn't out yet, the thing that you're working on, what has inspired you to work on? And for that question, we'll start with Mr. Goodwin.
Sure. So I think the my answer is very similar to a lot of your guests from the last episode, in that I didn't like what I was seeing out there in the world. When I was looking for books, I couldn't find something that I wanted, so I went and started writing my own story. But specifically, to really narrow that down more, because I feel like that's on some level the answer of every author, right? More specifically, I was seeing what we were having, what was coming out for epic fantasy at the time. This was about 3 years ago I started writing, and it's still true now, is almost every story for some reason, is about really miserable people who are surrounded by misery, and all of their friends are also miserable people, and they have all these horrible flaws, and they just are awful all the time. And like you traipse through the whole story of just everybody being terrible to each other, but also, you know, continuing on towards the same goal because reasons. And I feel like Game of Thrones really started that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. You like those stories, that's awesome. I enjoy some of them too. I just felt like that was every story. And I was sick of that being every story. So I wanted to write my own story about, these are actually good and inspiring people who you might actually want to be friends with, and they actually like each other and get along and have reasonable morality, and so it's somebody you can root for and not kind of feel dirty about at the same time. So that was my inspiration for this entire series. I feel like I really accomplished that to the extent that I liked with the first book, and hoping to continue doing that in the future.
Very cool. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for positive protagonists in modern media. They're very lacking, or their existence is very lacking. There's very few of them, unfortunately. And unfortunately, they've taken even some older media protagonists who were positive and sort of upbeat, and have made them more downtrodden, which is unfortunate. Like, I'm thinking of the Doctor from Doctor Who, who he
Every
was.
Disney property,
DC, yep. That
or Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, exactly. Yeah.
Lucasfilm too, yeah. I mean, Luke himself, right? We see Luke and what they did to him in the sequel trilogy. And whether you like the sequel trilogy or not is kind of irrelevant. It's more just the
Mhm.
question of who Luke was at the end of episode 6 versus who he became in episode 7, or episode 8 rather. And yeah, there's a bigger conversation there, and perhaps we could have an episode titled character assassinations, and that might be a fun discussion panel. But I do like that you're working on a world with positive role models, and I think there's the show Frieren. It's an anime that is on
Mhm.
Netflix, and I've only watched the first 2 episodes, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. But they did a really good job of that, I think, where they gave us positive, heroic character for the most part. There was like one guy whose negativity and his nihilism was sort of used as a comedic beat. Other than that, they were pretty much good-hearted people who had positive intentions and a positive outlook on the world, and that was very refreshing. So, thank you
Mhm.
for writing that. So, same question. With the inspiration behind the world, I want to go to Nathaniel, Mr. Zisteroth. Talk about what inspired you to finally sit down and write, and what inspired what you're writing about.
Well, what inspired me to sit down and write was developing a part of my world that was so interesting that I had to write it. Because I just sit here developing things for the world often, and I was just like, this I have to actually sit down and write this part right now. And so I got started that way. Um my world has so many inspirations from so many different bits of fiction, because I take ideas I find in fiction and just run with them. So like I can't really name a single thing.
That's fair. That's okay. I mean, I think back to the old adage that I actually first heard at the college you and I both attend. I was attending a class on, I believe it was may have been a creative writing class. It may have just been a general literature class. I'm not sure, but the teacher said, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." And that's very true. I find that to be the case. If we don't study the masters, we're doing ourselves and our readers a disservice. And in studying the masters, we find aspects and ideas that we like, we want to weave into our own stories. Ultimately, I think that goes back to who we are as people. As a Christian, God has endowed us with part of His image, and that image is is a creative force. as he created the world, so too are we called as writers and authors to create things. And so, taking inspiration from others is only a natural outgrowth of that. So that's really cool. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So, thanks for sharing. And then, Sean, was it? Mr. Fitzgerald, how about you? What inspired your current work in progress?
This is going to be a very long and convoluted answer, so I'll do my best to condense it. I'm currently working on book 5 of the Alone Together series, and book 3 is about to hit sometime later this year. Um, I always wanted to write like a zombie style story. I think it probably started around high school for me, and that has evolved because I wanted to make it something that wasn't already out there. And that's very difficult with some of the media that's come out, not just recently, but if you go all the way back to probably the legend like George A. Romero, and then all the offshoots that produced, and then we can probably all remember when Max Brooks released World War Z, um, some colossal giants to try and outdo. And I had this idea in the back of my head for decades, and at the time period, I was a infantry commander during the COVID years, and I saw a lot of things of how the military realistically responds to situations, and that kind of shaped the story that I would end up telling in Alone Together. Um, so a lot of it's based off that experience. I wanted to bring people into a realistic military mindset. They're not bumbling buffoons like a lot of media portrays them as, but they're also not some elite tier end all be all response to a chaotic situation. Um, so I shifted what I was writing, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a zombie story, while many of my readers probably label it that because of the way it starts. I wouldn't classify the monsters as zombies, but that was kind of the shifting point of what I wanted to write, was to bring non-military people into a military mindset, and then bring as many, I would say, uh, normal, everyday, average people into a drastic survival situation, in where every day you're going to work, and then one day that traffic jam becomes a nightmare for everybody around you.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think that's a good perspective to want to bring. Someone who's actually served in the military. That's cool. I think, and this is just my own personal perspective. So as someone who has not, but respects those who have, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that military personnel, in many ways, are human too, and so they can make mistakes. They can misjudge situations, and so with zombies, for example, if you're in a setting where zombies were never even part of the sort of the pop culture mythos of the day, they weren't in mind, and you all of a sudden you're a military guy been told to secure this facility against what amounts to a horde of people walking towards you. What you don't expect and what can really screw with your head is when you see a person from that horde jump on someone else and start eating them. And what that does to the mental is, often untold and unappreciated by a lot of audience members. So, yeah, very cool. I'll. You said you're on book 5, like you're writing it now, but book 3 is about to be released.
That's correct.
Okay, cool. That definitely sounds like a great series if you're into that sort of horror um genre, which I would imagine a lot of my listeners at this point probably are. So cool. Thanks for sharing. Uh, yeah. So from there, I wanted to kind of get into our world building. So it sounds like some of us have smaller scales, but some of us have bigger scales, which is I wanted a variety of takes on this. So I'm glad we got a variety of. So second question I have is, when you built your world, did you go from macro to micro or micro to macro? So when it came to developing your magic systems, your politics, all of these things, did you start with like, okay, this is the name of the world, this is the name of the continent, this is the name of the country, this is the name of the political parties, and then get smaller and smaller and smaller? Or did you start the opposite? Like this is Jim Bob. He's a blacksmith. He lives in such and such township. He lives under the rule of King so and so, who rules over the country X, Y, and Z. And so it grew from a more individualistic perspective. And I think for this one, we'll start with Mr. Goodwin. Um, where did you go? Did you go from small to large or large to small when you're building your world?
Well, that's a great question. I think people like to ask that, but I reject. I'm gonna be a little spicy here. I think I reject that dichotomy entirely. I
Okay.
think that that's not really a useful way to look at the world. I know a lot of people. I have written stories in both of those ways, but it in both cases it kind of puts you really far away from both of from most of the most important information. Right, your most important information is what is the largest unit that your story is going to interact with. You know, what what is the biggest thing that is going to be used to motivate or inspire my characters? And if that thing is just their parents, you don't need a world beyond their parents. You know, if that thing is, in the case of my book, it's going to be the nation they live in. You know, these people are trying to protect the country they're from, then you have to start with that country and really make it give the reader some kind of an idea of what that is, because otherwise they're not going to care what happens to it. So I started with my Roman Republic analog. What is it like? There's a limited amount of world building you need to do when you're directly mirroring something from the real world, except to make the difference. Start with what's different between this and the real world. When I say this, how am I clarifying the distinction between what you think when you hear that word and what's in my story? So I started with that and worked down to like, okay, this person is trying to defend their country. So obviously they're in some sort of organization that does that. They're not just running around on their own trying to do things. So what's that organization? What's it called? What's it like? What's its structure? What's their place in it? And now you have this whole, you have a direct line from the person to their largest goal, and that forms their personality and how they interact with the world and the people around them and all those things. So I think that's a much more useful starting point. To be honest, I don't think my world has a name. If you're going to ask me what the name of the planet is, I don't have one because it's not relevant. The person in this story isn't thinking about an entire planet. They're thinking about where they live and where they're from and the people immediately surrounding that. So I think you get lost in the weeds when you encourage people to either take that top down or that bottom up thing. You're thinking too much about creating a person with specific character traits before you think about all the things that form that character trait, those character traits, such as where are they from and what are their overarching goals. So
Right. I do think.
If I may,
Oh, yeah,
if
please
I
go for
may,
it.
that I agree very much with the pertinent information is what you need to develop. If it's not pertinent, don't worry about it. However, uh, the approach of the character of the character first and then the world is also itself just an approach. You can develop characters from your world instead as well.
definitely, yeah. And I wouldn't want to. Again, none of the things I say here are to disparage any of these ways of doing it. I just think when we talk about this, if there's somebody who hasn't written a book yet and they're listening to this and they think, oh, I have to start with, I either have to start with the whole world or I have to start with one specific person. I want to push back on that narrative. So you don't have to do that. If your story is about this whole, you know, really, first person perspective, this person and really drilling down onto who they are, then it makes 100% sense to start with them and developing them fully fleshed out before you fill the world around them. But you don't have to do it either of those ways, is my position.
Right. I think part of a good story and a good world is the world will naturally be reflected by the characters. For example, and I'll just, plug my own work here a little bit. I forgot to talk about my inspirations, but it's fine if you listen to the last
As you
episode.
should. It's your
Yeah.
show.
Yeah, no, it's fine. But I'll talk about it a bit later. But you'll hear my inspirations behind my stuff in the episode that's going live tomorrow. So for the listeners of this show late, it will be last week's episode. Very confusing. But anyway, using my own world as an example, I used the characters in part to inform the world, but also vice versa. There were several pages when I first started writing this draft where the main character was known as the boy or the young hero or our hero. And then once I finally figured out a name that was a very appropriate name because of who that character is in the biblical canon, and that name being Thomas, the that it kind of did both of what I'm talking about and what you're talking about. It allowed me to go back and fill in the missing name segments from the early pages. So now the first few pages don't just have the words "the boy" or "our hero"; they actually have the name Thomas. But then also, it helped in so discovering his name late in the process. Also helped determine how he would act late in the book because of the implications behind his name. Doubting Thomas being a character who
Mhm.
asks a lot of questions and a lot of hard questions. So there is something to be said for a middle road, and that's kind of what I opened with in this episode, talking in my little monologue at the beginning. Sometimes you have different levels of need when it comes to building your world. For those of us who are working on an epic fantasy, and maybe yourself not included, Goodwin, but for myself, I have a few other fantasy books that are on the back burner. One of which I'm doing exactly what you're talking about. I'm not worrying about anything until it becomes relevant to the character. In the other situation, I've built an entire world. Like I've drawn a map, I've drawn up kingdom borders, and all these things. That way, I can have a flesh and blood world that my character then interacts with, as opposed to a world that sort of comes into being around the character. It's sort of the difference between Skyrim world building and Witcher world building. In The Witcher, from my perspective of having only played like the first game for a couple of hours, you don't really get much information on the world building until your character comes into um those details, comes into contact with them. Whereas in Skyrim, from like the first prison you walk through in like the tutorial thing after the dragon attacks, you can find a book that gives you like the history of the world, and it's like there's so
Mhm.
much more world
Yeah.
building in, like, at least immediately available to the individual consuming the media in Skyrim as opposed to Witcher. So there's a place for every style of world builder. And so don't let anything I say or anything that my guests say discourage you, listener, from building your world how you best see fit. Because later on, even in this episode, we'll talk about different techniques and different systems when it comes to actually building out those worlds. Because there's more than just like micro macro. There's also like building relationship trees, or there's a program called Obsidian where you can create
Mhm.
like thought spider webs and stuff. It's really cool. But we'll get into more of that later. But don't let anything we say, dear listener, discourage you from building the world how you see fit. Go and build your world how you want. And Zitzeroth, you jumped in earlier to talk a little bit about world building, and I want you to do more of that now. Actually, you did you go from macro to micro or micro to macro? And if not either of those, did you also have like a third sort of more unique take on it?
Well, the way in which I develop my setting is entirely starting with ideas. I take ideas and I go, okay, I think, well, let me give you an example. there's a group of people in my setting that live uh, a really long life, have a really large lifespan, but the consequence of that is that they disintegrate and fall apart when they are reaching the end of that lifespan. They developed a thing to enable them to live longer without disintegrating, but when they remove that thing, they disintegrate instantly rather than over a period of time. And so a tradition grew up amongst these people to put these items, these tokens, upon a central place in their community. And this part of this world came, this idea started from a visual from a song in which I listened to, of this tree of sword and jewels, and that was an idea. I was like, ooh, that's a really cool idea. And so I took that idea and I was like, okay. Then I had an idea of the ancient elf. I was like, okay, what can you do with that? And then I had ideas that stemmed from the magic system I've developed, and I was like, okay, what if we add that to it? And that all came out to be that community. And as a natural flow of those ideas, I developed that community. And so my world building largely stems from this idea finding and then making those ideas connect, and what's the most logical way that what would naturally form from these ideas. And sometimes that means I start working on characters immediately, or sometimes it means I start working on continents. It really depends on the situation.
Yeah. And I think that ultimately is what a lot of world building is, very situational. For example, I'm currently developing a world totally separated from my book writing stuff. At least it's separated right now. I might write a book in this setting eventually later, but right now I'm writing it for a D&D group, and I'm creating my own homebrew world. And the way I've gone about writing the wiki for my players is essentially I would write an article, kind of just by the seat of my pants. Pantser when I don't have an outline, but I think everyone's a pantser when they don't have an outline. But anyway,
True.
I'm writing this by the seat of my pants, and then as I'm writing it, a cool idea like Nathaniel was just talking about will germinate in my head, and I'll write it as a quick sort of offhand reference in the Wikipedia article. And for example, in Keep Sar Dramir, which is the Keep of the Silver Dragons in this setting, it reads, "The Silver Coast seat of power, from whence reigns Halnar Osrunson as king, is the beating heart of the Great Alliance and the best place to go and find adventure." So there are several things in that article which then spring out into their own Wikipedia or their own like wiki articles. Like what is the Silver Coast? Who is Halnar Osrunson? And then what is the Great Alliance? And so there's all these questions that can be asked, and I've been able to then go and write small articles on those individuals and link them in this one. So my players who are reading through my lore can click a linked article and go there and find more lore, like the Great Alliance. When you click that one, it brings you to an article that talks about humans and barbarians. Okay, what's the difference between humans and barbarians? And what is the Great Western Sea? And so you can ask these questions. And so there's different ways of writing our worlds that I think are also partially affected by what tools we use to write them. Because writing individual articles is much easier on a platform like what I'm using called Obsidian Portal, not sponsored by the way, but much easier to write individual articles for cool ideas like that. Whereas, like if I were to do something like that on Google Docs, for example, where I created a new document every time I had a new idea, that'd get really tedious really fast. Especially a couple years ago, back before they had the document tab system. Now it might be easier, but back then it would have been a nightmare. And so I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We'll get into that, I promise. Hold fast, friends. Hold fast. And now let's give Fitzgerald a chance and talk about the system he's used, or not the system, but the perspective he's used to develop his world. Is it macro, macro, or macro, micro, or some third amalgamation?
Yeah, I've been sitting here the entire time listening to you gentlemen go back and forth on this and struggling with trying not to ruin the big like plot twist that happens later in the series. Uh, so for Alone Together, I had to find a way to cause the shift in the planet, and I wanted it to be realistic, and I wanted it to be something that wasn't universally already done elsewhere. And I found that answer in my first novel. So there is an Easter egg for those who went through, read that novel. When they hit that moment later in the series, it will be a aha, I know exactly where this came from. Anybody else, it won't impact it. It'll just kind of be a happy little connection. So cosmically is where it started, which is kind of ridiculous if you consider that the first two novels don't leave the same city here in Florida. Uh, so there is a cosmic element that I've had to include in there, and tying that back into a very personal horror story has been little elements that the series has allowed me to go into, right? When it all kicks off, the individuals don't know why. There's a bunch of rumors, there's misreports, there's assumptions that are being made. And I've had a lot of fun with that. Even on the advertising side, I'll say that I even created a series of fake news reports that when I was building up to my first novel, I released those fake news reports as advertisements. So you got like a snippet of a newspaper, fictional, of course, that kind of tied you into like this could be something that's real, but we don't know what it is. And that's the
Nice.
approach I took for the Alone Together series. Not as granular as a fantasy series would require, but it did require shaping the way the events happen because later in the series there's a realization that this isn't just a normal type of outbreak. I don't want to say it beyond that word. It's not a virus. It's not a yeah. I'm going to leave it
Sure.
at virus.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's cool. So there's something to be said about that, and I think Goodwin might have a bit of a laugh here because I'm gonna bring up something that I haven't brought up yet this episode, but Wheel of Time, which is a great inspiration behind everything I do as an author because of just how amazing that series is. Um, kind of thwarts all of what we're talking about. Granted, I don't know how Robert Jordan did his world building. I honestly wish I could have been in his mind or like a fly on the wall when he was writing out the world for the first time. But um, if he hadn't had a bigger world in mind, we would have never gotten the Shan Chan. And if we never got the Shan Chan, we would have never gotten a lot of the fun stuff with Matchroom Cawthon later in the series. And if we hadn't gotten that, we may not have rescued a really important wizardess character later on in the series. And there's a lot of things to be said about the domino effect of world building. I think Zisroth kind of touched on a little bit, and I kind of doubled down on it with my talking about the Obsidian Portal Pro program that I'm using, where an idea can generate an idea, which can generate an idea, and so on and so forth. And I've even done that in my own writing, like I mentioned earlier with Thomas. His name both helped me fill out the world more in the early chapters, and then it also helped answer several questions that I had about how I was going to do certain things in the later chapters. So there is a push and a pull, a yin and a yang to our own systems, and so the most important thing is to capture the idea. Again, not sponsored, but I'm going to talk about him anyway. There's a great YouTuber called Exurbia, but instead of an I, it's a one. And he writes short stories and records them as YouTube videos sometimes, but he also has put out a novel, I believe, at this point. And on his second channel, he put out a video recently titled something along the lines of 4,056 ways not to write your first novel. It was basically just a video talking about how he wrote his first novel and he found it recently. He realized how terrible it was, and he was sending this book out to agents and to publishers all across the world hundreds of times, thinking it was the coolest thing in the world. And now that he's looking at it today, he's like, "Well, this is." But what he's, or as my generation might put it, this is cringe. But what he wanted to drill into us was that it's important when you have a good idea to write that idea and not give up on it. So, he said that he doesn't believe it, and I agree. There's no such thing as a non-creative person. There's just people who sometimes are too busy to be creative. Because, and I've experienced this, I have, believe it or not, I have worked a blue-collar kind of warehouse job, and I know for a fact there are several book ideas and several awesome, world-building, artifacts or, inspirational quotes that I could have used that came to mind while I was stocking shelves or getting merchandise. And then I didn't have a notepad in front of me, or I didn't think about it later, and now they're just gone. They're just forever lost to the void until I maybe can recapture them later on in life. And that's an unfortunate reality behind the creative arts, is unless you have time and the opportunity to catch it in the moment, off.
Yes, boredom is key. Boredom is a requirement.
Yeah,
Not going to get into my personal story, but I did want to talk about Wheel of Time real quick because
go
I
for it.
was looking forward to this very
Mhm.
specifically because I know you were a huge fan of Wheel of Time, and I'm sure
A
you.
little bit.
Sounds like you saw my tweet earlier where I said I really don't like Wheel of Time.
I actually didn't
Um,
see it. No, the reason I mentioned that you might get a laugh out of this is because you said that you listened to the last episode, or at least part of it, and
mhm.
in the most recent episode I have on Spotify right now, I say that I should joke. I jokingly said that I should call this a podcast "Wheel of Time with Authors," because I just talk about the book series so much. So, but no, please
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, I am not a fan of Wheel of Time for a wide variety of reasons that I will not talk about here. But I do think there's nuance here in that I agree. Robert Jordan is one of the best world builders in fantasy, and I take heavy inspiration from his style. I have absolutely stolen several of his literary techniques that I'm using in my first book and in my second book. Um, it's great. There's a lot of really good stuff there, and I highly recommend aspiring authors read his books just to see how he does that. The first, three, I think, to really get the feel. Um, but I think, and I don't want to turn this into Wheel of Time cast, but I think when you read those books, and I've read the full series twice, even though I didn't like it, because I wanted to see what I could learn from this. Um, Robert Jordan sets up a really excellent world, but it doesn't stay realistic. It doesn't stay true to itself because as things change, specifically the Shanchan, a massive force that completely alters the whole world. The rest of the world kind of just goes, oh, that's not good, and then doesn't change, and that's not really how society would work. So I think one of the to bring it back to world building, the things with as an author we have to think about is not just how do I build this really cool world, but as you go through the story, like, okay, how does my cool world change? How do the things I like change as people, real human beings who are, at least real enough for the story, would react to the things that I'm introducing to the story? And I think we see a lot of authors fail at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
May I?
I think Goodwin, you and I should definitely do a Wheel of Time debate at some point in the
I could do
future,
that all
because
day. That'd be great.
that'd be a lot of fun. Because it doesn't sound like you enjoyed it, but it sounds like you respected the craft, which I think is the most important thing. But yeah,
No,
so
and your point in your first episode about the death of that one character is absolutely correct. That was a phenomenal moment. That was
yeah,
death of a character done really, really well. But
especially with how he had been corrupted, but then came back. Yeah, it was
yes,
very, very, very good. And I think Um, and this is kind of off off the beaten path a little bit. I didn't have this moment planned, but Sean, you mentioned that you have been in the military, right? And you were even in command. It sounded like.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I
Okay.
was a captain in the Army infantry.
So just real quick, I kind of want to get everyone's thoughts on this. It seems to me that when it comes to writing stories and writing fantasy in particular, there's something to be said for having gone through a military background, or having military experience that can make you a good author, or at least a best-selling author. Because we know Tolkien, Granddaddy Tolkien, he went through the trenches of the Somme, and Robert Jordan, he fought, I believe, in Vietnam, and there are several authors writing today have wartime experience and whatever. And so I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts are on there, and keeping it world building related, like how that experience might affect their the creativity of their worlds. Like they've experienced other cultures, they've experienced these things on a much more personal level. So do you think that that adds something to their writing, Fitzgerald?
So I'm gonna go to your example. So yes, you wouldn't have Lord of the Rings without like the horrors that persisted in World War One.
Mm,
But on the flip side,
Hmm.
our most notable military thriller writer never served in the military, and that's Clancy. Clancy never
mm,
served in the military. And if you're talking about other military authors, he has to be included in there because he is probably most well known for writing the military world.
totally.
Uh, I don't think that it makes you a great author. I think it just broadens your experience, and that can be, the world side of it. You did tell me, to be very mindful because I do have a dirty mouth from the military, so forgive me. I won't drop any f bombs on this. I promise. Uh, that being said, there's a weird perception the first time you step foot in a truly alien culture. So it's one thing, I'm going to just pick on my British friends real quick. You don't really experience it going between the UK, Canada, United States, but when you step into someplace that has a dominant religion that's not one that you've ever been exposed to, one that dictates laws that are completely foreign to anything that you have or anything that your history directly came from. It is a little bit of a shock. And then seeing the customs and norms and even the landscape. I remember being in places in Africa that it felt like I was standing on the surface of Mars if I didn't know any better because the way the sun hit the ground and the rocks were literally burnt black or red because how long they've been exposed to the sun. So there is that. I don't think that the military experience necessarily ties into becoming a great author. I think it just gives them more to draw from. And you could probably get the same thing from somebody who's just a very avid traveler. Um, I'm in a society called the Dark Veil Society, and we have authors from all over the world. And one particular author I know travels quite often between the United States and the Czech Republic, Blake Meyer, phenomenal writer. Um, he has more European experience than I ever will because of places he has to go on the regular. Um, and we also have an author down in South Africa. He has more of that experience than I will ever have, even with my time served in various different countries all over the world, because I no longer do that. So I do think that it gives them more to draw from. I think that going back to fantasy side, it shaped the fantasy that you guys are all drawing from. And I'm just going to say that Tolkien probably is the predominant one because so much of modern fantasy draws from him, either directly or indirectly. And because of that, the military has greatly influenced fantasy. We can say the same thing, though, about science fiction, right? If you look at the evolution of science fiction, it started with Frankenstein, which now we all look back and we say, it's a horror novel. At the time period, it was very much a science fiction novel that was based on what their
Hmm.
understanding of human anatomy was from that time period. But if you look at how science fiction has evolved since then, science fiction really took off in the 1950s. And what was going on there? We had the end of World War II. Europe was being rebuilt, but we were dawned into a new age of nuclear warfare, and the Soviet Union was in power in Europe, and we had the Cold War going on, and we didn't understand nuclear power yet. And if you look at all the science fiction from the 50s into the early 60s, that's very much what we were talking about. Out of the Silent Planet is very much a critique of, the critique of capitalism versus communism and nuclear power, and that has shaped science fiction. So it's very difficult for us to break away from the military influence. But this was a very verbose way to answer your question. But overall, I don't think it makes you a great author or it's even a requirement of any nature. But I do think that it just provides you more insight into how the world works.
True. And I think there's something to be said for a movement away from military fiction. I mean, I think a lot of us, especially guys, we grew up with military fiction, like Lord of the Rings, like all the video games we played and whatnot. But um, there's been a movement of this new subgenre called cozy fantasy or something like that. Is as far as I know, there's no like battles or sword fights or anything, which like part of why I haven't read it because it's like why would I read a fantasy book about orcs with not sword fighting? Seems like a bit of a waste of time for me. But um, the fact that so many fundamental books were written by people who have that military background, I think definitely has shaped how the genre has gone. And your point of the atom punk of the 50s and 60s, I think, is very well taken. How the worlds were built, in those times when it came to the sci-fi settings. Um, People were hopeful of the future, and you can see that there was a clear, bright hope for what would come next with things like the Jetsons, for example, being a good example, and also a lot of Isaac Asimov stuff. I mean, sure, I mean, and maybe Asimov isn't the best example, but definitely Heinlein. I'm thinking of more of Heinlein, I
Yes.
guess. Heinlein has a lot of hopeful science fiction, and like what would it be like to grow up on Mars and then try to come back home to Earth, live as a human? And there's a lot of these things which good, and fantasy is getting there now with stuff like that cozy fiction business mentioned earlier, where there's hope. But also, I like what Goodwin mentioned earlier in the show. He was like, I'm writing characters who are good people, are positive protagonists, and that's what we need. We need good people and good stories. And I also like there's a hashtag out there called Tolkien Rage, used by haters of Tolkien to talk about Tolkien as they read Tolkien, which I find hilarious because even when you hate Tolkien, you're still going to talk about him. You're still going to discuss his craft. You're still going to discuss his writing style. So even people who don't like the guy are still going to talk about him, which is it just shows how just sometimes obnoxiously influential his stories are. Yeah, I think we'll move on from that. That was kind of a sidebar anyway. I apologize, but we'll
If
get
I
back
might, real
to.
quick.
No, you're fine. And it was kind of for you because you had mentioned that you're military, and that came to mind when me and JM were talking about the world of Wheel of Time, given that he was also a vet. But yeah, that was a good sidebar, but a sidebar nonetheless.
Yeah,
Um,
and real quick, just because you
Go for
mentioned
it.
it again, Goodwin's
Uh-oh.
point about not liking that characters right now, it seems to be the trend of making everybody morally gray. I don't know if it's necessarily prevalent in the fantasy community, but it certainly is in the horror community and the sci-fi community. This trend of having to justify why a villain is a villain. So if you do have a truly detestable character, there seems to be a trend to really try and make you associate and relate to them. And that's quite opposite of what, especially in fantasy, if you're using Tolkien as the example, the orcs at the time period when he wrote it were the mindless, faceless blob of horror that was coming after you to, burn your village and kill everybody. But for some reason that seems to be the trend of like they want to know why the serial killer is a serial killer. Make me like that person. I don't want you to like him. That's the point of him being the bad guy. That's something I'm seeing that I kind of relate to what Goodwin said, and I just wanted to put that out there.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people are like, when it comes to that concept, a lot of people are just looking at themselves and realizing, well, I'm morally gray. I have some perspectives and some beliefs that some people like and some people don't. So my character should too, theoretically. And like I'm coming that like I see that, and when it comes to my own writing, I'm coming at it from that perspective because as a Christian conservative on a college campus that is, let's just say, less than Christian sometimes, the I have a lot of perspectives that some people that I meet on campus totally agree with, and other people think that I'm one of the worst people in existence because I have such and such belief or such political position. So that there's a desire to see yourself on the page, and sometimes that desire goes too far. I think we need the black and white. We need the moral correct or the moral wrong, and there's some of that's missing. Good point.
May
Now,
I?
oh yeah, please go for it.
Yeah. I think that both having a bad guy who's understandable in their villainy and having a bad guy that is just villainous are both very useful tools for storytelling and should not be applied universally.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of my bad guys in my setting. I go, well, yeah, some of them I do try and make understanding, but there's also this bad guy here who's just a bad guy. Just a bad guy. There's nothing else to them. It's just they're a bad guy.
Right.
And I think both can be very powerful if you use them as tools in the right ways.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I love the mantra that the villain support group in Wreck-It Ralph said, "I am bad and that is good," because they recognized their position in the story was to be the villain, to be someone that the protagonist can struggle against, and in a way, having that is a good thing. Um, there so there's a quote which I can never pin down who it's by, but the quote from one of the greats in the fantasy. I think it's Lewis, so I'm just going to attribute it to Lewis. That says, "We don't need fantasy stories to tell children that dragons exist because they already know that dragons exist. We need fantasy stories to tell children that there are knights who will come and defeat the dragon." And so I think inherently we know as people that evil exists in the world, but ultimately our media should be doing the job of giving us hope and giving us, lighting a beacon, well, keeping that beacon lit and helping us see a better path forward. I think we'll jump now back to a couple of the last questions I had. We kind of covered one already just in our talking, so I won't do that one, but I will jump to one that's kind of more technical. As writers, and this is something that I had never thought of until a friend, or they will be a friend, but a peer of mine at a writer's coffee house that I went to a couple Saturdays ago, he brought this up because he's totally brand new to the hobby of authoring and writing. And so he brought up the idea of what program do I even use, or like what technology should I use? And so I wanted to kind of ask you guys, when it comes to building your worlds, like I mentioned earlier, the program of Obsidian Portal, which allows me to write article to article and write little blurbs about little different inspirational things as they come up, so I can skip around. What do you guys use when it comes to the pre-production process of your stories? So generally, I'm talking about world building, but sometimes the world building only comes in the outline or in kind of a bland world building document. But if it's more than that, I do want to hear it. And even if it's just that, I still want to hear it. So like, let's start with uh, my friend Nathaniel, because I know how expansive the world building has gotten. At least how expansive it had gotten when we talked about it a couple years ago. What program do you use, or what systems keep track of all that?
So I'm very weird in that most of my world building just fits in my head and I don't even need to put anything down to remember it. I just remember it. However, I have at times needed to share it, and at that point in which I will use like a Google Doc to just write it down and so show, hey, here's the stuff in which I'm thinking about, and show it off that way. Um, but yeah, I've also used Obsidian a little bit. That's a great program, and I definitely want to start using it more to store ideas. But I've largely been able to just keep it in my head.
And that's fair. I think keeping things in your head is not necessarily the worst place to keep it, as long as you can remember it. Just I would encourage you for a backup, a physical backup at some point to write it down. But totally. And then
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I want to get more into Obsidian, because I think it's a great program for exactly what I need
yes,
for doing that. And so it's just a lot of time. I have so much. It's just a lot of time. the The initial setup for it is just going to take forever.
how about you, Goodwin? When you're getting ready to tell your stories, like maybe you aren't an outliner, you just write by the seat of your pants. But when it comes to the pre-production of your work, what do you do to work on it? What programs do you use? Word, Pad, Judgment.
So again, I think Notepad would be pretty wild. Uh, I think again, I have fairly controversial opinions on this. Is I think a lot of, and I have, so for reference, this is the book that I ended up publishing is the third novel that I wrote. The first two were awful, so they will never see the light of day. But the first one, I put all my notes down. I had a physical notebook that I carried around and wrote things down in. The second one I used World Anvil, similar to Obsidian. And what I found, and this was part of the growth part for me as an author, what I found was I spent not more time, but a disproportionate amount of my time managing my notes and writing things down. And I would sit down to work on my notes and update them with all the stuff that I had written or was about to write, and would end up bloviating on the page, basically world building away, because I love world building, but none of that stuff was ever actually going to make it into my story. So for me personally, the tools are a bit of a hindrance because they encourage me to waste my time on minute details that are either going to get changed or aren't in the story, and then I go write the story and I have to go back and change the notes because I ended up not using the notes. So not to not to denigrate using all these different softwares to build these things, but in my opinion, I think something authors should do more is borrow from, at least fantasy authors. Different genres do different problems. Sci-fi don't do this, but for fantasy is a setting as much as it is a genre. It is a vibe for your reader as much as it is a specific world that the author has created. So it is because of that, as an author, you can really benefit from leaning into an already existing, already created world. And so that's why I wrote in a Roman Republic setting that is just like the Roman Republic in a lot of different ways. Because not only do I not have to spend a ton of time world building and writing notes and explaining to you in my book how this world is different from whatever the standard fantasy is, I can just jump into the more relevant details. And you already feel familiar here. I can mention a thing and you go, I know what that is, and move on. I can mention the Senate and you go, yeah, the Romans, they had a Senate. Cool. They wore the togas. I don't have to tell you they wore the togas. I don't have to tell you what color they were, all those things. Um, and I think also, like, on the magic and the monsters and all that thing, I leaned kind of heavily into um, the general D&D setting. You know, orcs are big and green. Tolkien, they're not green. I can't lean on Tolkien. I do uh, more in D&D because I think that's much more what's in people's mind at the moment. That's the standard for the average reader these days, is not so much Tolkien, not that they haven't read them, but Dungeons and Dragons inspired, or which is kind of like a melding of Tolkien and Warcraft. And when you do that, you don't have to have this massive extensive notes. So for me, since I'm leaning on already existing IPs as kind of the floor for this room I'm building for the reader, My notes are just like specific facts, names, specific places, and their descriptions. What's the main character's armor look like? What's the name of the ship that he's in? Those things or this side character who shows up 2 or 3 times in each book. What does he look like? All those
Totally.
things. So, and I just have that in a bunch of different Word documents. One for names, one for organizations, one for places. So to make sure I'm getting the details right. But since the world is mostly a vibe, which is how the reader is going to experience it anyways, you don't have to have all those notes. You can just go off of that landscape that we've already built up in popular culture, if that makes sense.
Totally. Thank you. And yeah, Fitzgerald, same question to you. What systems do you use? Go ahead and talk about it. I have to step away for a second, so if I don't get back, but by the time you're done, feel free to talk amongst yourselves. I'll be back.
I'm gonna drive you nuts, Goodwin, because Alone Together is very much set in um, United States about 2024. I don't give you an exact month when everything kicks off, but I have an extensive setup of everything that I need to do. But it's because the timeline is crucial to where the series is going. So book one kicks off, and as much as the reader knows, they know as much as the characters. Um, and slowly, as the series moves on, they realize that what they thought was, I'm going to say, day one of the outbreak, it wasn't. They realized that it had been going on months, and then later on, they find out it's been going on for years, and they didn't realize that certain events were leading up to this. So I had to go back and make sure certain things don't conflict with each other, because I can't have event B happen before event A and things like that all the way down the line. So in the Dark Veil Society, I get teased every now and then because the tool that I really enjoy using is PowerPoint. And I know that sounds kind of
Really?
ridiculous. I get teased about it quite a bit.
This
But
is the military training, isn't it?
no, it is not what it. So I experimented with all these fancy tools. I can't. Let's see. I'm trying to go back. Like I tried Scriver. I enjoyed it at a point because I took a lot of my lessons from Mike Crichton, who I think is he's definitely my personal favorite author. And his method was the note card method. So when he walked around throughout the day, if he had an idea, he'd put it on a note card and he just used those to formulate what he needed for his stories, um, which I still kind of do to a certain level when I travel. I have a pocket sized notebook that I take with me, and then I have a larger notebook that I have grander ideas in. But when it came to making the story itself, I wanted the note card ability without having to always have my note cards on me or having them laid out in front of me every single time. So Scriver had something like that, but the interface was driving me nuts, and I just I couldn't stay up on top of it, and it was a pain kind of moving it around on my computer. Um, I tried Campfire, which a couple years ago was a phenomenal website, but they've locked so many of the features behind a paywall now, and I didn't feel like having another service that I was going to pay for. That, as much as I love writing, this is not my primary source of income, so I wasn't going to sink that much into a subscription service for projects of this nature. And I was trying to come up with what I wanted, and I work I, I'm not going to say it's cybersecurity, but I work very adjacent to cybersecurity now. And I have to do a lot of education with people in a specific industry, which I'm just going to keep it private what industry I work in, because it's too easy to identify certain people if I name it. And I realized like there's so many functionalities in PowerPoint that people just generally don't use that are like, this would be phenomenal. I can just do this. I'm already comfortable with PowerPoint. It comes with the package I'm already paying for. I'm just going to use this. So I use it quite extensively for a lot of things. I create character cards on there. My main characters get very fleshed out on there. I keep significant events and where they happen in what book, because I need to keep track of that in the notes section on each slide for that particular character. Um, so the part that people tease me about all the time is I have what I call the death pile. I move my characters into a section of the PowerPoint where all the dead characters are. So I still have the information of that character, but they're out of the linear progression of people that I need to actively be tracking. Um, so, as a horror author, it's nice to say, yeah, I got a death pile lined up here. Um, but the timeline is significant, and then certain areas are very important because even though the primary events are happening in the United States, there's a tie-in with the Chinese and a specific city in China that um, I guess if you're a Chinese national, you probably know the city, but Americans don't know it. It's not that major of a destination, and the events that unfold there. So PowerPoint has proven very beneficial for me for both fleshing out my characters, creating the timeline, setting up areas that I need to keep track of. That way, I can go back and relate to them. And what it really enables me to do is create that emotional connection that my characters have with each other. Because obviously, horror author, I kill quite a few characters throughout the series, and these are characters that were built up very important, not just to the story but to other characters that interacted with them. And I do use Alone Together to explore trauma, and uh, that is a significant portion of Alone Together, is losing your friends, family, loved ones of various ages and events that are happening. So that's my primary tool. I have a couple others that are listed out there. Coincidentally, a couple years back, I wrote a blog about this very topic. I keep things simple though. Aside from that, I use Word. I do my first drafts there, and I do have a tentative outline that I do um, just by chapter. I just don't go into detail. I just say this needs to happen in this chapter, and I move on. It keeps me organized. Otherwise, I would lose certain details if I didn't do that.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
that is fascinating. Someone who uses PowerPoint. I love that. That is awesome.
I was gonna bring that up too. I've never heard of PowerPoint being used that way, but I mean, it makes sense. Like you're keeping everything in the same ecosystem, so I mean, it'd be pretty easy to get stuff from Microsoft PowerPoint, bring it over to Microsoft Word. Cool. But yeah, for myself, I would highly recommend uh using just a standard issue program like Word or Google Docs. If you're just getting started. If you think you have an idea for a grand venture, like a grand scale story where you need like political alliances and systems and countries and organizations and all these things, one of two programs I'd recommend: World Anvil or something called Obsidian Portal. There's a program called Obsidian, standalone program that I would recommend for just general note taking because it's a good like stream of consciousness note taking program. But there's a different website called Obsidian Portal, which is great for world builders. It's almost like World Anvil Light. That sounds wrong to compare them. Um, I'll just put it this way: there's a lot less ads on Obsidian Portal than there are on World Anvil. But yeah, so if you're going for a more grand scale thing, look for a program that I think not that I think, but look for a program that you think will best fit or needs are. Research the programs, obviously, but if you just want to get writing, if you just want to start writing, just keep it simple, stupid. You know, Kiss, keep it simple, stupid, and just use something basic: Word, Google Docs, Notepad. I mean, pen and paper or pencil and paper, even. Or if all you have is the receipt paper at your minimum wage job, print out some blank receipt paper and use your fingernail to heat write. Like there's you can do it. You can do this. If you want to write, you want to write bad enough, you can write. So just find whatever program works for you, whatever situation works for you, and definitely. So the next thing I want to go into a little bit, and I know it's kind of short notice for you guys, so if you didn't find it, that's fine. I wanted to know if you guys were able to find those 500, maybe 700 words that best show off or showcase your world building skill pros. Um, so it let me just ask the floor here. Were any of you guys able to find that section?
Well, I found something that conveys how in which I talk about my world in my book, how I explain it to the viewer.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah.
I Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Good one.
No, I just yes.
Yeah. Cool.
I do, but I did not know there was a word count to it. Mine's 950.
That should be fine. I'm not gonna sit here with a a lap counter and start counting up words, and then cut you off at 700 or something. So if it's a bit over, if it's a bit under, it's fine. I won't down this.
I think you should. It'll add some tension to this scene. It's a horror author, he has to know.
True. No, you're right. Okay, so for this one, I think uh, we'll start with Tom with this one. Actually, you kind of had the last piece there. I want to open with you this time. Go ahead and talk about, or not talk about, but maybe introduce the scene a little bit if you need to for some setup, and then jump into it. Serenade us with your best VA impression.
You don't want that because it would just be not service connected. So this is the prologue to my upcoming entry in the Alone Together series that will be coming out. I don't want to say the month yet because I'm sorry. I promised another podcaster I would do the reveal with him, but it's coming out this year. And the only setup you really need to know is this picks up on a key scene that the previous novel ended on. So the team identified something that was unusual, and they knew that they had to go back because they're worried that the situation is worsening with the infected. So I'll just pick up from right there. Roland's team returned to the intersection from the night prior. Julie claimed to have seen something in the meat market. Coupled with the lack of female infected observed in the recent confrontations, no one had a good feeling about their change their sickly friends were going through. We keep it simple. We aren't here for a long fight. Get in, see what's going on, and back out. Roland felt the tense jitters that jingled every nerve before a fight. Roland made eye contact with Foster first. He chewed gum and nodded. Luke and Alex shook. Their sweaty palms gripped their rifles, and Julie swallowed something that left a bulge down her throat. Lost in thought, he recalled reading studies. A first-time soldier going into a fight had his heart rate jacked, his limbs twitched, legs pumping up and down. Veteran fighters showed no such signs, but monitors showed that new soldiers and veterans were indistinguishable. The same volatile cocktail plot played within each soldier. Fear was universal, but how it manifested externally changed with experience. They moved out of their truck towards Silver Lake Meat Market. Some of Dylan's men were still at the farm collecting anything useful from the previous raid on Dominic. That gave Roland a 10-minute window, but Roland didn't want to risk using those 10 minutes. A lot can happen in 10 minutes. The meat market was housed in a squat building lined with tall power lines and aged split telephone poles. Morning dew slicked the green roof, and the dark windows fogged from the humidity buildup between day and night. A lonely power company's truck left parked as the only visitor. A telling reddish-brown smear made the logo ineligible. Decorating a spot in the overground corner sat an antique firefighter wagon from an antiquated century. The gaping hole of the front door created a chilling draft and the constant sensation of being observed. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight on the empty street. The absence of infected sent hair-raising tingling sensations up his back, like the market was breathing. The open doorway sucked and blew. Something lurked inside. He waited for him and Foster to seize the building while Alex, Luke, and Julia remained outside. The moment they shot, he figured infected would start coming. They would need to book it out of the area the moment that happened. Don't rely on the 10-minute window. Roland and Foster took the entrance by force. Roland snapped his rifle light on. Going right, Foster went left, being met with dead end. He corrected himself next to Roland. Something moved, in the dark, beyond the butcher's counter. Growling. Slamming on the counter, a ghost appeared. Pasty white skin, barefoot, shirtless, a bald head warped with inhumane muscles pulling at the face. The man's bloody face opened into a maw lined with sharp teeth. It screeched at their intrusion. Foster fired first. The rounds opened its neck. It dropped to all fours, rocking back for a pounce. Roland fired. Their combined rifle fire killed the man before he could make the leap. Right side, Foster called out. Roland's light swung. A thin, bald woman hissed. An afterthought, Roland's bullets splattered her brains and tissues against the wall. Jesus, that smell, Foster said, wincing as he cleared the market. No more infected lingered, but the back room held dozens of bodies. Rancid fumes assaulted their senses. Even with covered mouths and noses, the smell caused their eyes to water. Wet vomit across maggot infested meat. It repelled them back to the front with the two dead attackers. Roland looked at the male with his rifle light. The infected's muscles, taut and hard, strained against the skin. Not an ounce of fat on him. Wiry muscles he didn't know were possible on the human body lashed his back. Check this out, Foster pointed at the woman. Lean arms and tight muscles kept a twitch running down her left hand, but Foster's light illuminated her belly. Swollen, not by fat. Like the man, her body was clear of fat, clearing anything of unnecessary for the fight of survival. Swollen with life. What do you think it means? Foster poked the belly with his rifle. The same vague question rolled inside Roland. Could it be fat? No, it can't be. That's what, 4 months? Roland shook his head at his own question. The white of Foster's eyes shone. Pregnant? No, she had to have been pregnant before the outbreak, right? I don't know. I mean, look at the muscles on these two. They're jacked, and the body's there. The infected are stockpiling for something. Look at her eyes. Foster panned his light up to the dead woman's body. Her brow jutted out, a short, strong shelf sheltering her eyes. Unlike a person's eyes, the pupils were oval, like they were being stretched up and down. It couldn't be changes, Roland said. Foster huffed. You mean like evolution? No, that takes generations, right? Right, generations, like hundreds of them. But maybe chemicals play a part. Their bodies can accept raw meat and most people can't. Foster's voice came out in a shudder at first. So these things aren't just going to die out, are they? Roland's eyes went back to her swollen belly. How is it so large? His rational brain asked. His brain that trusted everything to make all the shots said she was pregnant before the outbreak, but the thick purple veins and red irritated stretch marks betrayed the truth. Roland, we gotta go. We've got company, Julie yelled from outside.
Nice.
Thank you.
And that
I like it.
you answered a question that a lot of zombie settings don't even bother to touch.
That was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that. I like. I caught something earlier that was kind of small. But I liked it. You use the word snapped when talking about like turning on a flashlight. I like it because it also implicates the sound as opposed to like flipping a switch. Flipping, like the word flipping doesn't really have a sound attached to it, at least not in my mind. But snapping, like that makes a lot of sense because you can hear the click as they turn on the flashlight.
It's a visceral word.
I'm very much a sensation author, so sounds, smells, taste, things of that nature are
Sensational.
more prevalent in my writing than just visual descriptions would be, like describing somebody's hair or facial features.
All right. Next, we'll jump to Nathaniel. What were you able to find from your prose?
All right. So bear with me here. This is This is a bit early. It's fairly early on in my novel, and I haven't gone back and revised it at all. I refuse to let myself revise until I'm done with the novel.
Okay.
Sayo watched the doors open with some trepidation. It wasn't every day the soon-to-be crowned king of a kingdom specifically summoned him. Though his company had worked for Fallen before, it was under the late king that he was hired, and only through representatives. The throne room was definitely the largest room Sayo had ever seen, let alone been in. From one end to the other must have been over 50 paces, with thick pillars running along the wall, patterns carved into them so fine as to make Sayo wonder if they had been made before Light's End. Between each set of pillars were large stained glass windows that each depicted a different piece of the country's founding. At the far side of the room, the throne sat upon a dais raised 3 steps above the floor, and beside the throne stood the crown prince. The prince was a tall man with shoulder-length black hair. He wore a white coat with a black trim with silver trees embroidered along the tassels. He stood with his back to the throne, staring at one of the windows. Sire approached the dais with a steady pace. When he arrived at the foot of the dais, he went to kneel, but was interrupted by a "don't" command from the young prince. The prince turned to look at him with a thoughtful expression. "Tell me, mercenary, what do you know of the basin west of the Wormfall Peaks?" The prince's voice was a soft baritone, and he had eyes that burned a cold intellect. "It's contested land, your highness," Sire replied. "Terrence and Colnia both contest your claim and each other's." "Good." The prince took a step down the stairs. "That will make this easier. The region has become a host to a rather large group of bandits. Their leader, one Edmund Tenthus, has the audacity to call himself king." The prince took another step. "Foland can't send any men into the basin, as if we were to try, Terrence and Colnia will declare it an act of aggression. Thus my father, may his soul rest alongside the lost stars, let it be. I, however, do not intend to allow an enemy to grow upon my doorstep. And so," he took another step. The prince now stood face to face with Sayo. "I turn to you. Tell me, how would you like a place to call your own, for you and your company?" "I would find it a place most desirable, as would my company." "Then I have a proposal for you, Ventus. I would make you a baron, independent of my kingdom but recognized by it. If you go into this basin and root out this bandit king, I will back your claim to it. And if Colnia or Tenthus or Terrent attempts to contest it, I will bring my banners to your defense. I will do this on the condition that should I ever call for aid, you will ride in my defense." Sayo could see it. A land to settle, to build, and to rule. He would not let this chance go by, but nor would he miss the opportunity for greater profits. As he saw it, the prince needed him and his company more than they needed the prince. "I would be amenable to this, your highness, but I fear my company is lacking. If your highness would grant my company a gift of 50 horses and lances with them." Sayo let his voice trail off. "Bold?" The prince raised a brow at him. Sayo tensed, awaiting a refusal. Perhaps 50 was too much, even for royalty. "But doable. You shall have them. Do not waste them." Sayo smiled, his tension fading away, and bowed. "Of course, your highness. Speak with my steward, and he will arrange your gift. Leave now." The prince dismissed Sayo with a wave before returning to stand again beside the throne. Sayo did as he bid and left the prince, all while smiling at the thought of what he had gained. Oh, the look on Verena's face when he tells her the news. It was going to be priceless. Fortunately, he wouldn't have to wait too long, for as soon as he was done with the steward, he'd be returning to the inn that he and his second were now staying in.
I think that definitely plays to your strengths as a political writer, like in the sense of, like, politics being the relationship between humans. You mentioned that you do a lot of it is political in your world building and stuff. Plays into that very, very nicely. Good work. It also, it's interesting that they're talking about the ideas of, like, of what it means to be. I think the title used was Baron. Like, some people, that's self-explanatory. Oh yeah, a Baron will ride when his lord calls him to ride, and when he is attacked, his lord will come to his defense. And there's an understanding there, but to have them hash it out in so many words is it's almost refreshing because it's rarely done. Cool.
Well, part of that is actually that he isn't. He the prince is not offering Sayo to become a baron under the prince. Specifically, he's offering to recognize him as an independent baron,
Okay.
independent of the kingdom. That's
So
an important part of the politics of the situation.
right. So they're forging more of an alliance as opposed to a fiefdom.
Exactly.
Nice. That's cool. Sharing. Um, and then Goodwin, were you able to find something?
Sure, yeah. So I'm just going to read a section from the prologue of my debut novel. I'm not ready to release anything from the second one yet, even though it is written. So, all right, here we go. So, the sea was burning. Canis Scipio stood on the deck of his flagship, the Invicta, and watched the wreckage of the Valorian fleet, his fleet, disappear beneath the surface in a wash of fire and screams. He took little comfort from the fact that more than twice as many enemy vessels had already accompanied them. His men had fought and died valiantly, as was expected of all true sons of Valorian, but at the end of the day they were still dead, and this victory of theirs would not outlast the year. He looked out over the unspeakable carnage of a battle fairly won, and felt only anger. No doubt the politicians would call it a great victory, even though the Republic had once again lost the better part of its fleet for the third year in a row. But what else could one do? Admit defeat? As a Valorian? Not hardly. Fools they might all be, good only at taking credit for other men's labors, but at least they did not lack spine, or stubbornness. Speaking of spines, Scipio stretched his own as best he could in the restricting legionnaire's armor, feeling every minute of his threescore and more years. Gods above, but the lorica was getting heavy. He had thought himself accustomed to its weight long ago. One ought to have been after nearly 40 years of soldiering, but it seemed that this too, like so many other things, only became more difficult with time. "Are you all right, sir?" asked an adjutant. Canis hadn't bothered to remember the child's name. He was probably some pissant son of a senator, no doubt assigned to his staff for a chance at glory or influence, and he had no time for such people. Neither did he grace his yammering with a response. "Have they finished searching for survivors?" he asked, not bothering to look at the crowd of officers certain to be gathered at his heels. "Yes, General, just now," said the same nameless adjutant. "The fleet reports nearly a whole cohort rescued from the waters." The senatorial moron said it with such enthusiasm it made Scipio want to punch him in the face. One cohort of survivors? His legion had begun the day with 20 cohorts between them. Now, rescued included, he might have 7. Spread them out over 9 surviving ships, and they'd barely have the manpower to make it back to shore, let alone fight. "Eyes on the enemy?" he barked. It was impossible to see anything from the Invicta's deck, as she lay in the heart of the wreckage. "3 ships, sir, all headed west as fast as their oars can carry them," he grunted. That, at least, was a resemblance was a semblance of good news. His foe had started the day with nearly 200 vessels, and gods only knew how many men aboard them. Normally he would glory in winning such an overwhelming victory, but the slaves of the successor kingdoms made piss poor soldiers, and even worse sailors, at least compared to Valorians. No, he thought, as he stared through the smoke and flames towards the land that crouched just out of sight beyond the horizon. The trouble with successor fleets and armies wasn't killing them, it was that they never stopped coming.
Read. Pesty barbarians never seem to run out of men.
It is the worst part about them, isn't it?
True. So I have a dictionary here because I bought a dictionary because I'm also a tutor. So I'm teaching kids how to read dictionaries. So I heard the word adjutant and I wanted to look it up, but it's not actually appearing in my dictionary. I have a newer one. Would you care to explain for the class what exactly do you mean by adjutant? I mean, I kind of got it from context clues. Like he's a plebeian. He's like someone who's just there as a sort of like a thrall for somebody else. But like what do you mean by it?
Specifically, a military officer who is a subordinate.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that
Military officer who acts as an administrative assistant to a senior officer is what Google tells me it is.
All right, that makes sense given that the context. Cool. Thank you. Um, yeah. So you mentioned letting the setting do a lot of the heavy lifting for you when it comes to the world building. But I like that you were able to have senator as a word, like, oh, we know what a senator is. Or you the character used about the how this agitator is probably just some senator's son, but he used some choice language that I thought was quite funny. Well done there.
Yeah, I will say I really believe in that personally as an author, and that's stolen directly from Heinlein. Is his world building story is present this to the reader as though they already know what these things are,
Oh,
and
100%.
that
And
it's I think there's a lot of people who really feel like they need to handhold the reader, or they've worked really hard on this since they really want to explain how intricate it is. But and you can do that. That's fine. It's not wrong. Especially science fiction really has to do that. But when you're talking about something that people already have an idea about, if you talk to them as though they already know, then they will fill those details in for you, and it feels more like their story than trying to remember all those facts you tossed on them. So definitely something I try to practice.
May I butt in here?
yeah,
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you just said there about treating your audience like they're intelligent, which is an easy
very well.
summary of what you just said. Um, and I agree. I think of that even with things in which the audience wouldn't necessarily know, as like if you a thing from your fantasy concept of your own. You should still talk about it as if the characters already understand what it is. Like we don't tell each other what the internet as a concept is every single time we talk about the internet.
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
and so like I don't mention, like, in my little bit I brought up, like, aside the lost stars, what's the relevance of that? There's clearly something there, but everyone in the setting knows what he's talking about, so I'm not explaining it.
Right. That's important.
Exactly. And I think this is something that a lot of newer authors really don't get right. And a lot of people, when they talk about this stuff, they feel like they have to explain stuff. And I think if you if you never explain what a thing is, you introduce a concept and then you never actually specifically nail down what it is or what it looks like or what it means, then what the reader just makes up in their own head is 100% good enough. There's and it doesn't matter if what they made up in their head is not what you as the author intended, if it doesn't look anything at all like what you thought it would, as long as it functions and that it performs the role it's supposed to in the story, the details are irrelevant. I think my favorite example of this is is from Red Rising. You look at sci-fi book about with a great many space battles in it. Some of them directly involving the main character, and at no point does Pierce Brown ever describe any of his spaceships. You know what they're called. You know that they're relative. Like some of them are really big and some of them are not as big. But that's it. You have no idea what they look like, and it's irrelevant, and it doesn't make those space battles any less crazy and impactful and interesting. So I think more people should lean on to that. If it's never described by you, but the audience still kind of gets the idea, then you haven't lost anything.
I
Yeah.
have a kind of an in between take on this, and I got this because my current editor, and she's wonderful, has pointed out that when I did my first draft of Alone Together, I did exactly that, and she was very lost on some of the terms, especially when the military characters were speaking. She said, "I need to have an idea of what we're having been said here between these characters. I don't know what they're saying." Um, and the way I found in between there was I had somebody who wasn't familiar with those things. So you can do the same thing in politics, or when you're talking cultures. And a simple example of this is she didn't know what nods were. NODS, right? It's an informal way to refer to NVGs or night vision devices.
Oh yeah.
So right in the middle of a conversation, she's there between all these other soldiers, and they're talking about the advantage they have over this group. Somebody mentions that, and she just asks, "I don't know what you're talking about," and he just looks at her and says exactly, "He's like, what it is." And that's an easy way to bring it in. And I have to walk that line very carefully because there's a element in the first book where supplies are extremely important, and you have to understand the constraint that the characters are under. So, I know because I have the military background what the capabilities of LMTV are, what the carrying capacity is, what I am allowed to do and not allowed to do when, if, before they collapse legally on a normal run road. My audience doesn't know that, and I don't expect them to look that up. But there's ways to feed that information in there. So I have little moments where I show the commanding officer struggling over the logistics of it, and just the way he's explaining that is explaining to you, okay, so the LMTV is a big truck, but it's not big enough for what they need, and things of that nature. And I never have to explicitly say LMTV is a big tan truck. I just tell them
Absolutely.
the constraints that they're under. So there's ways to feed that in there, and I think this is what we're really talking about here is the show don't tell side of writing, right? You want to show them the entire area. You don't want to tell them it's a truck. I have to show them it's these are the constraints my characters are under.
Yeah. I to bring the exact example in which I use the aside the lost stars comment later on in the book, I explain what the night sky looks like, and at that point, you will understand what that reference was to, because there's no stars in the night sky,
Right.
and so really, it's about choosing where to explain things, and what's the most natural way to bring it up.
Yeah, agree.
Yes.
Sometimes the most natural way to do it is in a glossary in the back. There's nothing wrong with that. Several
Dune.
times, yeah, Dune, right? Several times
Yes.
in Wheel of Time, I was reading something and the characters were just nonchalant, like yapping about something, and then I was like, okay, what does that even mean? And I had to jump to the glossary or like on to Google, and I'm like, what is this talking about in reference to the Wheel of Time? And it would give me a good answer. So, but yeah, there's time and a place, and I think you guys might not like my expert excerpt as much then, because I do kind of take time to kind of more directly show the audience the world, which then for the rest of the book it's very implicit. It's sort of implied that all these things are still going on, but like I'm hoping that the reader will imbibe enough of the vibe, as it were, in this scene to then be able to partake throughout the rest of the book. So my bit here is from a chapter called The King's Call. It's the it's the scene where Thomas is arriving at Camelot. So there's a lot of new things from it reads, the road was white with stones as they approached the great city. All around them, the members of the caravan saw how the splendor of Camelot bled out into the surrounding country. Farms were still half full of grain, houses were clean, the roads were smooth and well maintained for miles outside the city. As they drew closer, buildings became taller, and the distance between buildings diminished until there was only enough space for an alleyway between every other building. Thomas did not really know what to expect, but all his dreams could never have. People filled the streets. Bakers stood behind stalls selling warm loaves. Jewelers stood in their shops holding necklaces made from polished gems of all different kinds. And smiths had their forges open as they worked with apprentices, selling and trading with any willing visitor. The stories were true then. When the king called, it was not only the warriors and craftsmen from faraway countries who answered. Thomas thought about visiting a smith before the games began and have him so that he may have him check over his sword one more time. That would have been disrespectful. Master Talon in Onwick was just that, master blacksmith. His work did not need double. Glamour of the city increased step he south, the heart of The sights, smells, sounds, even the dust, all indescribable. Thomas took his eyes off the shops and the purple sellers for a moment to view what it was they were approaching. About a half mile before them, rising at least 40 feet into the air, were the gates of Camelot, that great city, at the heart of which King's Castle. That would surely be the destination of the caravan Bill traveled with. Gates, however, were as magnificent as anything else in the city. Roads were clean, the people mulled about, but no one looked purposely. Every man had his woman her chore, and every child their game. Thomas could spot several other caravans approaching the gate. Many of the men, women in groups were stalking and staring just as he had been. Thomas adjusted everything on his person. He approached the gatekeeper, making sure everything was as presentable as possible. After an hour of standing in line, it was finally his turn. Name and purpose of visit, the guard said. His accent was different than what Thomas had ever heard, but it was still English. Thomas, son of Jeremiah, I come to answer the king's call, Thomas said. Let me look. The guard set down one piece of another, began flipping through sheets of parchment. Ah, here you are. From the village of Alnwood, right? Alnwick, sir, formerly the castle of... Thomas was cut off by a raised hand from the guard. I know it well. Best not to be saying that name around here. Locals are superstitious. Think it brings bad luck, they do. The guard explained. I understand. Thank you, sir. Thomas looked into the city, then back at the guard. Checks out. Can go. Good luck in the tournament, Thomas, and welcome to Camelot. The guard waved a hand. When Thomas began moving, he heard the guard call, Next! So, what I was trying to accomplish with this scene is giving readers a sense of perspective. They've been stuck in a backwater village where not much is going on for the first 8 chapters, and now in chapter 9, they're being their whole sense of world is being expanded. At least that's the hope, that they'll come to realize, oh, there is a much bigger world here. There are people from all over Britain, not just this one city, coming answer the king's call and fight in the tournament. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes across in the reviews and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense what you're doing because sure you're talking about a historical era and it's fantasy certainly, but you're talking about a mythological place that certainly everyone has heard of, but that has been depicted so many different ways and so many different places and times. You really have to narrow down in the eyes of your readers what this actually looks like. You need
Indeed.
to say, I am talking about a Camelot of this type and of this era, since they're not, you just say Camelot, they could think 20 different things, and that's going to give a very different vibe. So I see why you did it that way, and it definitely makes sense.
Yes, as immediately when you started, I was like, Camelot. It's a silly place.
A silly face.
And that's not the Camelot you're describing.
Right. And it gets into it more when he actually gets into the heart of Camelot and the castle in particular, the keep Camelot as it were, and yeah, I that reference is just tis a silly place. Love Monty Python, but of course for budget reasons they couldn't go to Camelot, so naturally they had to belittle it. Yeah, so thanks for sharing those excerpts, guys. Those were really fun to listen to. The last question I always want to end with this. Podcast is all about inspiration and Beacon Lit. I want to know what advice you would give your younger self. if you go back in time and have a conversation, or a 1 or 2 sentence inspirational moment with your youthful self, what would you tell them? We'll start with Goodwin.
Well, I think the best advice I would have is not really a unique one, but it's be bored more.
Hmm.
Definitely take the time to be bored more often because that's the source of all creativity. I didn't start, I always wanted to write. I wrote something when I was in middle school, and we will never speak of it again. But I always wanted to write, but never actually sat down and tried until I was in my 30s because I was, you know, making a point of never being bored. And then I was working a job as an unarmed security guard, really a mall cop, just not in a mall, and would sit in an empty hallway for 12 hours a day. And, maybe 3, 4 people go by at any given time, but I had to be there. And so I started writing. My first book in my head was just plotting out what it would be like, and like even like memorizing whole paragraphs, because what else are you going to do when you have to be awake and you're in an empty hallway for 12 hours? So I think if my younger self had been a little bit more willing to be bored, I would have started my writing journey much earlier.
Yeah. Boredom is the one of the key ingredients to creativity. Necessity is one of them too. Necessity breeds creativity, but boredom is part of it. Well, I guess boredom, it could lead to a necessity for your mind to be occupied. Kind of like
Exactly.
hand in hand there. Yep. So great. Thanks for sharing. And then Daniel, how about you? If you could talk to your younger self, what would you tell him?
I actually mentioned it earlier. Don't revise. Don't revise before you finish writing, because I have tried to start writing a dozen times, and every time I would write a scene, and then I would like go to bed, and I'd wake up and I'd read the scene, and I'd revise the scene, and I'd revise the scene, and I'd revise the scene, and I'd never get anywhere.
Yes, I can echo that one.
and
Mm.
so and so my the only advice I'd give my younger self is just don't revise until you're finished.
Yep. But also finish, complete the work, and then go back and
Oh, absolutely. Don't revise until you're finished, specifically.
good. And then Sean, how about you? What would you tell your younger self?
Well, it's funny because I kind of disagree with both the previous sentiments that were said. Um,
How
One
dare you?
primarily because I found myself writing when I probably shouldn't have been, but I needed to do something to get the stories out of me. So I didn't have the time to write, but I stayed up and made myself suffer at night so I could get those stories out when I was extremely busy. And on the other side of it, every time I open my manuscript, I at least edit the previous paragraph, but neither of those are critical. I think there's not a right way to write a story, but there's 1,000 wrong ways to do it.
True.
So, what it really comes down to, if I had to talk to my younger self, is I would tell myself to stop stopping. There were several times in before 2010 through, and then from 2010 into like 2015, I tried writing, and I talked myself out of it. I finished novels multiple times. I had manuscripts in 80, 90,000 word range, and I just decided that I couldn't do it. I didn't know what I was doing, but that's kind of the part of learning. And I would have just told myself, like, even when you get to the end and you feel like crap, keep doing it, keep doing your short stories. Um, that start and stop set me off for so many years where I didn't get to experience and learn. Now I'm making up for all those opportunities I lost trying to relearn things.
Yeah, I went through a lot of that. I say as part of kind of my intro that I've been writing for 12 years. I've not been noveling for 12 years. I have been writing, and a lot of that was me taking breaks from novels and writing short stories, and a lot of it was there were even some stretches where I wasn't. It was just kind of working or playing video games or doing other things that I could have been using that time more productively. So, completely agree. Stopping. I think myself, if I could talk to my younger self, it would be to keep writing anyway. It's similar to stopping, but um, there will be people who come around and view what you're doing as a writer as not worthy and kind of useless. But don't listen to them. Keep writing anyway. I started writing as a Percy Jackson and the Olympians fan fiction writer. And I not even like online. Like I had no idea that there were fan fiction like boards and stuff you could go and write on. I just was so inspired by those books when I read them when I was in high school, middle school, high school, that I wanted to write my own characters. I wanted to be part of that world. So I wrote, short fiction about self-insert that was totally like a OC Don't Steal esque character. And my brother actually told me, he was like, you can't make any money off that, right? And that completely took the wind all out of my sails, and I stopped writing. Even though I look back and I realize there are authors who started out fan fictioning and have since transitioned into very successful and lucrative original content careers. And part of that, I'd imagine, is just because of all the practice that fan fiction gives you. Like, however you're writing, if you're listening to this and you've been down in the dumps because you can't really do much world building because you're already in somebody else's setting, don't worry about that. Keep writing. Keep working on your prose craft, because prose craft is a huge part of it. Then also step out on your own too. Start building worlds. Start telling stories of your own divine, and you'll get there. And getting there, the word "there" in that sentence is different for everybody. So don't compare. Comparisons is the theft of joy. Right. So now is the time when we begin wrapping things up. I want to give all of you a chance to plug yourself, shout yourself out a little bit. We'll start with my friend Nathaniel. Do you have anything out there that people can like follow? I mean, this X account, obviously, but like, do you have an art page that you post stuff on, or do you have any way that people can reach out and follow what you're doing?
At the moment, no. I really, really don't. I don't typically use any form of social media at all.
Solid.
Good for you.
I don't blame you.
I legitimately haven't used this X account for about 6 years. This is the first time I've logged on in about 6 years.
Oh, impressive. Most impressive. Cool. Well, that's both tragic, but also probably healthy for you. Hopefully, eventually, once you get closer to publication, you'll have more things.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a valid. It's a very useful tool for marketing.
100%. All right, Mr. Goodwind, or Goodwin, rather, no D, but just Goodwin. Where can people find you? Do you have a website? Do you have just the X here?
I do not have a website yet, but you can buy my debut novel on Amazon. And again, it's The Isles Called Strife, and I'm published under J.M. Goodwin.
Cool. And Sean, how about yourself?
I'm going to be long-winded, unfortunately.
Naturally.
So I do write under SS Fitzgerald. I currently have several novels out. The Alone Together series currently is my flagship series, with Alone Together and then Alone Together Factions. And then in a couple months, we'll have Alone Together Hostiles joining the series. Sinner's Pass and A Fold to Extinction are also currently out there. You can find me on my website, ssfitzgerald.net. No spaces, no special punctuation aside from the .net. I'm on most social medias, to include X, Facebook, and Instagram. I also am the host of a podcast called Birds with Words, where I interview authors, other artists, video game designers, and just kind of talk about anything that we find interesting. So you can find me on any one of those. If you want to join my newsletter, you can also go out there on Substack. I also write under SS Fitzgerald there. And I only post monthly, so if you join that, don't worry, I won't blow up your email box.
Fair enough. I definitely go support everything these authors are doing. Buy that debut novel from Goodwin. Follow Fitzgerald everywhere. Buy his books. Myself, you can find me right here on X at AB Timothy Author. I would recommend that if you want consistent updates from me, like, several times a day talking about what I'm doing, and even I'm editing through the Shards of Arthur's Shield right now, and so every time I finish editing a chapter, I post a screenshot of the chapter's title and the first paragraph. So you get little book snippets if you follow me here on X. So follow me here on X. If you want to know more about where you can support me, view the link tree in my bio or in the show notes below. That has everything. If you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, thank you for tuning in. Definitely check out the show notes below or the description, and come over here on X, give it a follow. And on that link tree, you'll find not only my X, but you'll find my Spotify, my YouTube, where I host this show, and also my blog, where I post several times a week. But my newsletter only goes out once a week. So if you're not looking to get blown up by every time I write a blog about what I'm doing, you can delay those notifications for about 7 days if you want to just sign up for the newsletter and get it once every Saturday. Too. My website is abtimothy.com. The newsletter is abtimothy.com/newsletter. Go ahead and give that a look. If you want to support the show financially, feel free. In that link tree, you'll find a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can directly support the show and earn shout outs and whatnot from the host. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to my guests for joining me in discussing world building. It was a grand time, and I want to point this out. If you want to join the show, also look to my X, because I have constant ads for this show where you can sign up to potentially be on the show, and also had something else there, but it's gone now. So join this show if you'd like. Next time, we'd love to have you on. If you're an artist or creative. And yeah, remember, as you go about your week, keep the beacons lit.